Welcome, bienvenidos a todos. It's a bit strange. I feel like I'm sort of talking to my colleagues, but also talking to this strange void space. So I hope that everyone is here with us, and welcome. This is a webinar entitled African Women as Activists, Entrepreneurs, and Voices of Authority. And I just wanted to begin by thanking our team at the Center for Asian and African Studies at El Colegio de México for their support, Janet Satomi, and our director, Amaury Garcia. And on behalf of the center, welcome. And as I would say in Wolof, Dalen Akjam, you're welcome in peace. This is a project that aims, so it's a project that is based on a collective book project that my two colleagues have much more experience and hands-on with how the book developed. But the book is called African Women and Their Networks of Support, Intervening Connections, and was edited by our other colleague who isn't with us today, Eileen Kloite, Mariah Stumber, who is here with us, and Martha Ndakalako-Bannikov. So the two of them were also very integral into this editing the book. And the project aims to really highlight the various ways that African women intervene or actively participate to initiate change, as Eileen says, through channels of formal and informal politics, activism, and literature, among others, by way of sophisticated networks exercised in local neighborhoods or online. African women have been crucial to their own as well as societal shifts. Our goal is then to highlight some of their stories through their writings, biographies, and activism. So that's just a little snapshot of what the book is about, and has many interesting and diverse chapters. I should probably present myself. I am Emily Riley from the Center of Asian and African Studies at El Colegio de México. I'll be moderating and also participating in the event. So I'll introduce Mariah Stumber, our first, our colleague, who will speak first about her specific research done in Namibia, which I should also add that, as when I was at the University of Kansas, Mariah was a good and remains a good friend of mine. And I always knew her more as sort of the star of the Swahili language crew, doing also research in Tanzania. And we went to Tanzania together in the summer of 2019, I think. And she is a doctoral candidate in women and gender and sexuality studies at the University of Kansas. And I'm happy to report that she will soon be moving on to a position as visiting assistant professor at Hamilton College in New York. So congratulations on that. That's really great. And she'll be talking about, in her presentation, about sort of everyday types of revolutionary acts among women of the Namibian liberation movement. So I'll let you take it from here, Mariah, and I'm hoping that you can share your screen.
I will go ahead and try to share my screen. Okay, can you all see that?
Yeah.
Okay, great. So I'll get started. Thanks for the introduction, Emily. And I wanted to say thank you so much to the College of Mexico. I don't speak Spanish, I'm so sorry. I should, and the Center for Asian and African Studies, and Dr. Riley and your colleagues for hosting us. I'm really excited to be here and to have a conversation and learn from all of you. And also thank you to Dr. Ndakalako-Bannikov. It's always a pleasure to be on a panel with you. And I just wanted to say to anyone and everyone that's out there, especially those in Mexico, it's really a special joy for me to be with all of you because in a past life, I worked with international students at the University of Washington, and a lot of our students were from Mexico. So it just brought me great joy to prepare this and to envision all of you there. And I hope that Martha and I can come visit in person sometime. So we'll have to plan on that. And I hope you'll come visit us up in Kansas and New York and Minnesota. We'll be all over the place in the States next year. So so I wanted to also comment that I especially love the title of our session today that that you all chose, the African Women Activists, Entrepreneurs, and Voices of Authority. And I thought it was really fitting for the entire book project. And I know that with my research, it really encapsulates the women in my work and my writing in all the innovative ways that they were leaders and entrepreneurs and activists. So thank you for that great title. And I thought that I could give just a little bit of an overview of Namibia before I delve into my research. But I included a map here of Southern Africa and then a map of Namibia just to get us situated. And I also included a zoom in map, and where I study the scope of my research as well as Martha's research is in Namibia there, right next to South Africa and bordering Angola, Zambia, Zimbabwe, and Botswana. And I thought to give you some context, it might be, well, actually that's on the next slide. To give you some context, I thought to compare the population would be interesting. So Namibia as a country is very sparsely populated. It's a huge country, geographically speaking, but it only has about 2.6 million people. And if my math was correct, Mexico itself is about 2.5 times the size of Namibia in terms of surface area, but has over 50 times the population. So it's just to illustrate what a relatively remote and sparsely populated country Namibia is. And some of the important things, I don't want to assume you're not familiar with Namibia, but just in case you're not, I kind of told you where it is. I won't regurgitate all these facts here, but I put the current president, Hage Geingob, and just to reiterate, it is very sparsely populated, also really dry, and most of it's desert, but it's also very diverse in terms of the north is more lush and full of trees, and then as you get south, it's more of a desert. So if you ever have the chance to do research there or visit or study abroad, I highly recommend it. It's also not only in terms of the land itself, it's very diverse in terms of the people of Namibia. There's many different ethnic groups there, many different languages that are spoken throughout the country, and especially important, I think, to the whole story of Namibia, but to my specific project and to a lot of the projects in our book. Namibia was subjected to the Apartheid regime from, depending on how you calculate it, the late 1960s until Namibia got independence in 1990. And again, if you're not familiar with the apartheid history, that was basically a legal form of segregation where Black Namibians were pushed into townships and other parts of the country, and the white colonial settler regime took over, and it was a very violent time in Namibia's history. And ultimately there was a war of liberation waged from the 1960s until independence in 1990. And you might be familiar with South Africa's apartheid history and Nelson Mandela and the story of Robben Island, but also know that Namibia is a part of that apartheid history and anti-apartheid struggle as well. So I hope that was helpful in terms of a little bit of overview. Forgive me if I told you things you know. And I'll now delve into my chapter for our book project. And the chapter of my book project, like Emily or Dr. Riley said, is entitled "The Revolution is in the Everyday: Women in the Namibian Liberation Struggle." And I'll tell you a bit about the chapter itself and then update you on where this project has gone in the meantime and the current scope of my research. So in the chapter, I talk about the women that were fighting against the apartheid regime. So this was actually an all-out hot war, especially in the north of the country. And as we know, often the history books feature the prominent men and politicians and official leaders. But as my chapter argues, Namibia wouldn't have won its independence if it weren't for the contributions of the women. And this was often in ways that were quite quiet and unassuming, and hence the everyday notion, but that under a context of war, those everyday contributions became extraordinary and quite heroic. So, and this was also compounded by the double jeopardy notion of not only living under the apartheid system, where Black Namibians faced extreme racism and white supremacy and violence, but then also the positionality of Black women were subjected to a double jeopardy of their race and their gender, and oftentimes subjected to assault amongst their own cadres within the struggle, and due to the violence of the apartheid regime. So there was a lot of intersecting factors that made this an incredibly challenging time, as with any war, really. But I go on to talk about the different roles that women played. So essentially, I delineate them into three main buckets. So the military or combat roles. So in the struggle, there was a matter of needing all hands on deck. So women signed up to join the People's Liberation Army of Namibia. So a film that I recommend if you're Africanist, probably some of you in the audience have seen the film Flame, it features two women Zimbabwean freedom fighters. So this was the same idea. There were also women in Namibia and throughout Southern Africa, really, that enlisted and really wanted to be a part of the struggle. And as a lot of the women in my research talked about, they were completely motivated by something beyond themselves and a notion of more justice for themselves, for the people around them, and a free country, free of the terror of apartheid rule. So some of the other roles that women took on during the struggle were, in addition to combat, were caring roles. So I use that as a broad term to talk about nursing and medical work. There's a very famous Namibian woman doctor named Libertina Amatia, who was the first Black Namibian doctor and was really instrumental in the struggle, and then went on to be a politician and was a leader in healthcare policy in the country. And then, so combat, care, and then also leadership in all kinds of realms, whether it was within their communities or within the military or within organizations after the struggle, which in a lot of ways, the struggle prepared women for roles of leadership following the struggle. And there's also a theme, and I talk about this in the chapter, is there's a theme of deploying gender. So what would happen often is that women would use their gendered appearance to further the aims of the struggle. For example, I've heard accounts of women in the North who worked as nurses that would steal medicine for the anti-apartheid fighters on their side and maybe wrap them under a blanket and give off the appearance of that was their child, but really they were part of the liberation struggle and passing by unassumedly and basically deploying their gendered appearance for the interests of the struggle. So those are just a few examples that I cover in the chapter. And I wanted to give you a bit of an update as well, because really the chapter in the book was at the beginning of this project. So there were some there were some interviews included, but since the book was published, I've been in Namibia for 6 months and done a lot more interviews. So I wanted to give you a bit of an update. And I included here some photos of some of the women that I partnered with and wanted to share with you what some of their contributions were, just to bring it a little bit more to life. So on the left-hand side of the screen, you can see this is a family of women. So Myla Hapwood on the left and Maria Ndegwina in the red dress. They were both plan fighters, and Maria was actually a political commissar, which is a very interesting role because it was really a matter of her deploying her gender to boost the morale of troops. So she would be sharing SWAPO propaganda and pro-SWAPO messages and so on in the military camps. And then that's their mother, Susan, in the orange. In the center of the slide is Eunice Ipinge, and she's really a heavyweight within the SWAPO party. She leads the SWAPO Women's Council, and she was very active during the struggle as a plan fighter and is still in the realm of politics and heads the women's branch within SWAPO, which, when I say SWAPO, that was the Liberation Party in Namibia, turned the governing political party that's still in control in the country. And then on the right, that's Gwen Lister. She is the founder of the Namibian newspaper and a really well-known journalist and media leader, and she's still active in that role. But I admire her a lot because her newspaper spoke out against the apartheid regime and was firebombed numerous times, and there were threats on her life and a lot of the anti-apartheid strugglers. But as the title of the chapter in our book says, these were the everyday heroics that kept the struggle moving. So I'll talk a little bit about what have been my preliminary results. Basically, what I'm finding is that Namibia's history, all the way from German colonization in the 1800s, there was then a genocide actually of the Oba Herero and Nama people, and then going into the South African period of Namibian history in which the apartheid law was implemented in the country and there was tremendous violence and families were divided because there was an oppressive system of labor called contract labor, in which oftentimes men would be forced to go to the south of the country because that was the only job that was available. So families were divided in a number of ways, from the contract labor to the violence of apartheid to after one particular battle in Angola, the Kasinga massacre, there was a group of children that were actually flown to East Germany to stay safe. And while they did stay safe there, they were also taken away from their parents and taken away from their culture and their languages. So all these different divisions, I argue, have had enduring effects, lasting ramifications on Namibian society. And I'm really interested in the way this history of Namibia continues to affect Namibian people, Namibian families, and thereby Namibian society. So I think there I will wrap up my part of it. And I know we're going to have lots of time for questions here, but I'll stop my share and give it back to you, Emily.
Thanks, Mariah. Yes, and I do hope that people will have questions about anecdotes or stories that I'm sure you have lots of them to share during the question and answer So I'll turn it over to Martha Ndakalako-Bannikov, who is a doctoral candidate at the University of Oregon. And in the fall of this year, she will begin a new position as assistant professor of English at Gustavus Adolphus College in Minnesota. So congratulations as well. We all know in this environment, it's not easy to get a job. And she'll be talking about, also in the context of Namibia, about narratives of an online fictional diary. So again, Martha, thanks for being here, and take it away.
Thank you so much, Emily, for organizing this talk. And thank you to the Center for African and Asian Studies for hosting us. So let me share my screen and I will begin my talk. Okay. So my chapter in our volume is called Africa. Oh, sorry, my chapter in our anthology volume, African Women and Their Networks of Support: Intervening Connections, is called All This Drama, Intervening Narratives and Precarious Performances in the Online Fictional Diary, The Dream of a Kwanyama Girl. And just before I continue, thank you, Mariah, for your wonderful talk and for contextualizing Namibia, because where Mariah is talking about the era pre-independence, Namibia's independence was 1990, and the activism that women did during the war. My work is more contemporary, so I'm looking at like the last recent years and the literatures that have been produced, and as well as the gender dynamics, so sort of the afterlives of what Mariah was talking about. And so my paper is sort of about, you know, gender dynamics today in Namibia, and then, or recently, and then more so the afterlives of this particular fictional narrative. So my chapter analyzes The Dream of a Kwanyama Girl, a serialized fictional story which appeared on Facebook in 2014. I look at it within the societal context in which it was produced and in dialogue with a song released by the Namibian Kwaito music group PDK, in which they coined the term Kandeshi, in essence today referring to young women as gold diggers, particularly young women as gold diggers, and I'll talk about that a little bit further. Today I discuss not so much the text's afterlives as much as the environment, the continued social environment in which this digital text continues to be relevant. I say this because the anonymous author of this Facebook serial fiction has stopped publishing, at least on this platform. But the themes raised in the work continue to be relevant. These are themes of femicide and sexual gender-based violence, feminist solidarity and its relationship to tradition and nationalism, and the genre of Facebook serial fiction itself. These issues and this genre have continued to gain traction since I began working on this chapter in 2017. So to summarize the book chapter real quick. On July 4th, 2014, the first chapter of the fictional serial narrative, The Dream of a Kwanyama Girl, was posted anonymously on Facebook. Over the course of 29 chapters and a period of 57 days, the author continued to invite commentary and interact with the readers regarding the story. The narrative speaks to a popular discourse initiated by the Namibian Kwaito band PDK with the release of their music video, Dirty Kandeshi, in March, which was released in March of 2012. The song is about a young woman named Kandeshi, a single-minded, unintelligent seductress who preys on men for their money, and the men, essentially her victims in this scenario, are heartbroken. The song was a hit and elicited a dialogue in Namibian media, essentially around the question, what is a Kandeshi? 2 weeks after the video's release, an article in the Villager newspaper described it as, quote, the hottest and most played music video these days. In the video, PDK portrays the hustle of a wallet miner who uses her pout and curves to dive into the pocket of the most naive men to look in her direction, end quote. The video continued to gain popularity and discursive traction over the course of the year. And in January of 2013, a year later, the Namibian newspaper announced that the comedian Lazarus Jacobs would return to the stage with a new show, Keeping Up with the Kandeshis. When interviewed by the National Theatre of Namibia to promote his show, he was asked, "What defines a Kandeshi to you and what is your take on them?" Jacobs responded, quote, "I don't define who a Kandeshi is. It has already been defined by society as a gold digger." PDK member Patrick Moshindange described the band's motive for making the video as giving, quote, "a different perspective on a woman's hustle," end quote. But while the music is upbeat and the video is well filmed, a woman's hustle is portrayed in a derogatory manner that really is nothing new. Perhaps the only difference is that this hustle is specific to Namibia. 2 years after the song's release, The Dream of a Kwanyama Girl appears on Facebook. The Dream's author used the Facebook platform and a serialized fictional narrative to facilitate a dialogue with their readership concerning the Kandeshi lifestyle and the characters and direction of the story. The narrative tells of the experiences of the protagonist Angola. After graduating from high school, Angola leaves her village in northern Namibia and goes to live with her aunt Lahia in Windhoek, the capital city, to attend the University of Namibia, also called UNAM. There, Angola is drawn into the lifestyle of a Kandeshi, and her life becomes a series of precarious performances in which she must navigate her aunt Lahia's expectations and suspicions, and her desire for conservative behavior. And Angola must struggle to keep a clear head in the face of the glamorous lifestyle that her cousin Blackberry introduces her to. And she must manage the frequently unwelcome attention of the men who prey on her. The narrative positions Nangula's relationship with her cousin Blackberry as a sisterhood, and the relationship with her aunt Lahia as an antagonistic mother-daughter relationship. The dream shows how Kandeshi behavior emerges out of a complex melding of ideologies that constrain and obscure the woman's own desire for independence, and frames their self-assertion and acts of agency as deviance. While the narrative imagines the possible lived conditions of negotiating patriarchy and the frequently resultant sexual violence, the narrative also contextualizes this behavior within generational relationships between women, exploring tensions regarding traditional expectations for women in the context of city life, and it also highlights themes of motherhood and sisterhood. So I would like to draw out some of the main arguments that I make in my essay, in my chapter. The first main point that I make is regarding marginalization. And here I'm thinking of marginalization in the context of women, of the women in the narrative, so the fictional characters, and how their behavior sort of speaks to everyday women, real women in Namibia. So that's one of the contexts. And then also in the context of a literature that is produced on Facebook. Marginalization is not a lack of agency, but can be a source of productivity and innovation. I draw from Netta Kornberg, who argues that, while acknowledging the power of oppressive systems, challenges the notion of total powerlessness, commonly assumed in discussions of marginality. Power, she argues, is diffuse rather than monopolized at the center, and therefore, despite the asymmetrical binds that define the marginalized in society, this position also allows for some independence. It is a position and a space inherent with contradictions, but these contradictions are instructive. The second main point that I make is regarding African feminisms and activism. My chapter is in conversation with Oyeronke Oyewumi and others as I consider the role of motherhood and sisterhood in these texts and social contexts. I think alongside Patricia McFadden, who says, to paraphrase her, that sexual and gender-based violence is both bodily and discursive. It is, quote, heteropatriarchal violence, domestic violence, and sexual violence, but also includes the more powerful notions of patriarchal impunity and violation in discussions regarding women's bodies and their integrity. She goes on to argue that women's movements created in relationship with conservative nationalism only put women in stereotypical roles that inhibit radical feminist interventions. The dream reveals a conservative notion of motherhood tied to tradition that manifests in what McFadden calls, quote, gendered nationalist conservatism, end quote, that makes collaboration between younger and older women in the context of this motherhood difficult, if not impossible. Finally, I discuss the practical sisterhood that defines the collaboration between the Kandeshis of this narrative and the older women in marginalized positions. So on the one hand, you have these young women who are typed as Kandeshis, and then you have women, older women who are also mothers, but are less privileged and are struggling in society. And so there's a collaboration between these women. These women define the parameters of their alliance in order to determine how to gain measures of agency and freedom. Their desire is not to change society, but rather their own circumstances. And this is what their sisterhood is directed toward. So just to give you a quick example, in the narrative, the protagonist, Angola, lives with her aunt Lakia, and her aunt Lakia has all these restrictions. She wants her to behave conservatively. She tells her you have to go to classes, you need to stay away from boys, etc. But there's no real practical advice about how to survive and navigate society. This comes from her cousin Blackberry, who asks her at some point, do you have a bank account? And Angola says no. And so Blackberry says, well, women need to have bank accounts in order to survive in the city and this life. So she sets her up with a bank account. She deposits money in that for her. And then she tells her, you have to, keep the money flowing, in essence. So a very, very practical, down-to-earth advice. So I'd like to talk now about the contemporary environment. So this was, of course, 2014, but I'll now switch to more recent events. There are two main branches in my chapter, and these constitute how I think about the dream of a Kwanyama girl in the context of the environment today. The first is as a literary work, and the second is the gender concerns that this narrative addresses. As a literary work, the dream of a Kwanyama girl is part of a genre that is thriving and a group of popular writers that, per their readers, is unashamed to write stories about sex and sexuality in everyday life. As a text on gender relations in Namibia, the narrative revolves around femicide and sexual gender-based violence. The protests against this kind of sexual gender-based violence that we see in the narrative have erupted again and again in Namibia, and most recently with the hashtag Shut It All Down protests that occurred in October of last year. But first, let me talk about Facebook serial fiction. I ended my chapter by saying that I didn't know how well this work would transform discourses around Kandeshiism and sexual and gender-based violence. While the author has since stopped writing on this platform, and since they're anonymous on Facebook and I can't trace them, Facebook serial fiction is a flourishing genre in Namibia and becoming an innovative form that signals one of the ways in which African literature is reinventing itself in the digital age. As Zara Nesbitt Ahmad points out, quote, an explosion of new technologies has meant a completely new way of reaching and interacting with an African audience, not only changing the traditional gatekeepers of literature on the continent, but enabling creators and consumers of African literature to reclaim and then reframe their own narratives, end quote. Facebook serial fictions represent a vibrant writing subculture and reveal an interactive reading Namibian public deeply invested in the online literatures that they consume. This is an instance where the reader becomes the new decision makers and influencers in the African publishing world, proliferating literatures that may otherwise not have been published and supporting writers who ordinarily may not have written. While the reader has always been an important part of African literary production, in the case of these digital fictions, we see readers actively participating in how the narrative is constructed in relationship with the author. The Dream and other Facebook narratives thrive and develop large engaged followings and operating in the margins of the formal publishing world, means that the authors are able to tell stories that their readers want to hear. These Facebook narratives are frequently erotic, and their subject matters range to cover the complexities of inequalities in various kinds of relationships, the challenges to getting an education, gender dynamics and gender-based violence. They also speak about poverty and life on the streets, about the phenomenon of baby dumping, and so much more. And while these stories are melodramatic in many ways, the pages are also committed to the purpose of consciousness raising as a key feature of their storytelling. For example, on the page Asia's Educational Stories, the author Asia Martinho states that he writes, quote, "Stories to educate the nation. Everything I write about, I've seen and heard from people and things that are still happening today," end quote. Another prolific writer, Angelica Kawana, who writes on Angie's Comfort Zone, describes her page as, quote, "not just a storytelling platform, but a growth and educational platform too." These are, however, the stories that resonate with the readers. To quote Shola Adenakan, "The kinds of stories told on this page reveal, quote, how closely linked the personal and the political, the private and the public are becoming in the 21st century," end quote. While their focus is local, these literatures are post-national in a way that mirrors globalized African fiction, in that rather than preoccupied with the nation and nationalism, they humanize people in various contexts. They bring to the surface society's secrets while engaging the social and the intimacies of everyday life. So in other words, instead of using women and people to symbolize larger ideals like the nation, people are just people. People are just people confronting the complexities of their everyday lives. I will now turn to the environment of gender trouble that continue to gender trouble in Namibia that continue to contextualize the dream and the themes that it raises. So the Dream of a Kwanyama Girl deals with rape culture and gender-based violence in Namibia. Recently, the conversation around sexual gender-based violence erupted again in Namibia around the murder of another young woman. 22-year-old Shannon Russelball disappeared on April 9th in a coastal city. And in October, the police discovered her body. The protests that erupted at the discovery of her body were organized on social media under the hashtag Shut It All Down. Protests began on Thursday of October 8th in Windhoek, the capital city, and spread to other parts of the country. The police responded to the protesters with violence and arrested 24 protesters and 4 journalists, who they eventually released and dropped the charges. But such police violence only serves to signal the police's role in perpetuating sexual and gender-based violence. And on sites like Sister Namibia, and Sister Namibia is the longest standing feminist organization in Namibia today. So Sister Namibia's Instagram page, you can read stories about victims being turned away by the police when reporting rapes. And this perpetuates the culture of silence around this violence, and in essence, protects the perpetrators. The hashtag Shut It All Down protesters and activists petitioned for substantial political action to address femicide, rape, and sexual abuse. They called on President Hage Geingob to declare a state of emergency over these violences. They asked to review sentencing laws against sex offenders and for the establishment of a public sex offenders registry. They wanted more budgetary allocations towards units in charge of counseling and legal representation and policy execution in these cases, amongst other things. On Twitter, Sister Namibia outlined how the government response to the protests highlights the lack of an intersectional approach to sexual and gender-based violence in its call for calm and its appeal to conservative stereotypes of female identity, such as mothers and sisters. Sister Namibia responded to the government statement saying, quote, "We don't have to fit into stereotypical roles to deserve freedom, autonomy, and security. How can you hope to defeat gender-based violence if you cannot even demonstrate that you understand it?" End quote. In conclusion, I want to point out that, like many of the chapters in this book, This movement shows how media is transforming activism. The dream for me is a form of literary activism. And so to give credit to those who are actually on the ground in Namibia today and those activists who were protesting last year, I'll end with the activist and writer Martha Mukaiwa's words to describe hashtag Shut It All Down. Hashtag Shut It All Down was a picture of feminist and gender plurality, and activists have been clear to point out the various and particular violences and oppressions that women, queer, and trans people navigate. In her work, Martha Mukaiwa draws connections between sexual and gender-based violence towards women and children and customary law and customary practices, bringing to mind the dream's engagement of the relationship between gender and tradition. In her article, Mukaiwa writes, "Every woman remembers that increase of pressure on their hand when they were children. How our mothers would stop to greet some boring old man and suddenly their grip on our fingers would tighten in fear, in anger, in warning. As girl children, there were always laps in which we could not linger, sweets we could not accept, and men whose eyes never seemed to leave us. Often we called these men uncle, though they weren't. We'd be forced to say hello, accept their kisses, give them hugs, and come when we were called. Custom, for better or worse, dictated that we offer any man we were vaguely familiar with a respect and familiarity they had not earned, and in hindsight, misnaming these bloodless uncles was a terrible trap. They say uncles, men, teachers, the police, and the rusted machine of a failing Ministry of Gender Equality and Child Welfare have allowed sexual offenders and rapists to thrive while women and children cower below the tombstones of apathy, victim blaming, and incompetence. Shut it all down. It is an instruction, a hashtag, a movement." End quote. And so the struggle continues. Okay, I will stop there. I'll stop my screen.
Thank you, Martha. Such an interesting case study, and I hope that people have more questions as we move along. I again am from the College of Mexico. Hopefully, I assume most people probably know that. And I'm very happy to, be sort of virtually hosting you both here. And as Mariah said, I do hope that someday we can host you in person here in Mexico City. And I didn't realize, I think I had known at some point, Martha, that both here and in Namibia, the universities were UNAM, but I think I had forgotten that. So it's an interesting sort of anecdote. So thanks for that. And so I'm going to talk about my specific contribution that looks at women in women-led associations in the context of sort of women in politics and informal politics in mostly Dakar, Senegal, although certainly not something specific just to the city. And the context that I'll be talking about is the summer of 2017. I was doing some post-doctoral research with a few and some new women politicians as they were campaigning for the legislative parliamentary elections. And this is in the context of a new wave of women since 2012 as a result of a 2010 law that was passed that mandates parité, which is the French word for gender quotas. And so in Senegal now, in elected positions, ideally it should be 50% men and 50% women, although that's not always the case, but that's the idea. And so I've been curious for a long time, sort of not just what their experiences or what that looks like, what this new wave of women in politics looks like, but you know, the specific cultural and gendered strategies that women are employing in order to basically make the most of the authority that they already have within these kind of associations, but also what this law allows them, you know, the space to do. So I'll share, I think I have, the chapter talks about two specific women. I think I'm just gonna give the anecdote of, you know, I'll loosely talk about both of them, but I'll focus on one of them so that we can, you know, get to questions. And so to begin with Musli, on the rooftop of a newly constructed building that looks towards the port of Dakar, a group of women sat in a semicircle of chairs, listening intently as their peers gave testimony to the support they received from their leader. It was the eve of the 2017 parliamentary elections, and they were meeting with their representative in parliament, Honorable Musli Jakhate, who you can see in the pink dress, sort of more to the left. Who also happened to be the leader of the association that gathered them there. She sat amongst them wearing a striking pink dress with a black shawl for public discretion or for use to cover her head during prayer. Japo Juf Chijam, or Solidarity, Aid and Peace, was initiated by Musli to invest in income generating activities of women in her district of Yarach and Anbeler, parts of neighborhoods of Dakar. The group was like other groups focused on development, but also served as political support groups that were her base in political campaigns. One member stood up in front of the group and gave an emotional testimony of Musli's influence, saying, Musli musnama teral musnama bug. Musli, she has always helped me and she has always loved me. Musli was behind her, occupying her gaze on her rings, shyly rotating them around her fingers. The rest of the group erupted in chanting. Dignity alone, those who don't have it go nowhere, while banging on metal pots to keep rhythm. And then I'll also talk very briefly about Awa. 15 or so women sat together on a woven mat, each with their various items to sell, such as mint, fabric, or handmade soap, as they did every Monday. They drank tea and chatted while waiting for their association leader, Awaka, to arrive with a special guest, a current parliamentary representative of President Macky Sall's coalition, Awa Nyang. When Awaka arrived with Awa Nyang and introduced her to the group, everyone stood up and began clapping while one sang out to mark their arrival. Awa has arrived and she came with the honorable representative, the woman said. Awaka presented the representative to her association, saying, this is my group. We work hard. We don't have much, but we work for whatever President Macky Sall wants. We have nothing else but that. In a plug for her association, Awaka directs a question to Awa Nyang. If you can do anything, since before Macky Sall was president, we have been behind him and we haven't received anything. And you know the support people in Cambaren have given. And you and I have been together a long time. We don't know anything else but people. End quote. So Musli and Awa have two general things in common. First, both are vying for a coveted position in parliament. Musli was fighting to hold on to her seat in parliament, and Awa was looking to cash in her social capital for a spot on the presidential party's roster. Second, they see women's associations and social relationships as the gateway to make this happen. politics as a resource for their social and economic development. The women's praise for Musli demonstrates an affinity for her as a source of wealth and support, and as the women noted, teranga, in the Wolof version of the anecdote, the popular Wolof concept that implies the generous and civic-minded intentions of individuals embedded in acts of giving, hospitality, and general socialization. In the context of politics in Senegal, women who are particularly adept at the art of teranga, fortifying their relationships through financial and social prestations, have garnered significant support and success in state as well as local politics. The insistence on framing Musli's financial support for the association as a form of care or benevolence through the use of language such as teranga suggests something moral as much as economic, and illustrates the long-term investments made by women like Musli and the numerous associations throughout the city of Dakar. So these investments in the form of monetary contributions to kickstart projects or providing encouragement for said projects is intended to bestow the rights and obligations due to kin onto non-kin in order to expand one's circuit of exchange, or what Vincent Fouché calls performing munificence, a political strategy of generosity and patronage between a male politician and his female or male supporters. So what I sort of push forward and argue in my contribution is that in this new era of women's increasing formal participation in and access to state politics, it is women who form their own female-driven patronage networks in the form of these associations. Their performances of munificence or teranga cultivate both horizontal and vertical relations of hierarchy and dependence that utilize the arena of politics to advance personal ambitions, as well as collective opportunities to intervene in the allocation of state resources and policymaking. Furthermore, their patronage networks allow for women to emerge from this hidden public of male-dominated networks and potentially complicate the nature of the African state as a space of engendered inequality. And women's associations in Senegal have long been a source of support, financial stability, and a reliable heartbeat to gauge the wellness of communities. So it's not a new thing particularly. Since pre-colonial times, associations have been how women assert power in their communities as well. They range from small groups of friends within a neighborhood to more robust associations with significant membership numbers that are often sponsored by women of greater means, as we saw in the anecdote between the two Awas. Frequently, in the absence of state engagement with communities, it is women's associations that serve as protectorates of families, their health, their economic vitality, and increasingly local political representatives. Associations have over the years been the target of private and state-sponsored programs for money-making activities and microfinance loans from private institutions such as banks or non-governmental organizations. Following Senegal's economic crisis of the 1980s and 90s, microfinance programs were popularized by international organizations designed to boost small enterprises. Also, part of my argument here is that since the instauration of gender quotas in 2010, there has been inducted a historic number of women in state politics, and women's associations have become both the source and beneficiaries of this female leadership. The relationships between politicians and their associations and networks are established and maintained by formal and everyday displays of teranga, such as personal investment in the well-being of associational members via cash and material gifts, as well as professional support. Women then recognize the opportunity these relationships bear for benefiting from female support that is different from state institutional aid that comes with greater financial risk. The women I spoke with also felt that an increase in women holding political offices would directly result in long overdue attention to women's issues that men politicians had historically ignored, and that associations were the natural place to find future female leaders. So when I talk about this sort of both source and beneficiary, is that many women, as I'll show with Musli, start small with small neighborhood associations, then become leaders and directors of their own associations, and from there become visible to mostly male politicians or male-led parties. And so I'll give just kind of an idea of what, beyond just what associations look like. And the idea that because the chapter is called Sama Jigéen, or my women, my woman, is that, women have been traditionally very vital to men's campaigns, male driven parties, through anything from hosting rallies, organizing rallies. And so when I talk about this kind of what Linda Beck calls a hidden public, and that Aminata Diaw calls the presence, absence of Senegalese women in politics, is that they're fundamental to these men's campaigns and political careers, but have rarely, been in places of authority, meaning that they're, parliamentarians and are able to vote and have real authority and influence. And so, but yet women have been extremely important. And so these kinds of associations are some of the most visible ways to rely on social debt in order to pool resources for further forms of exchange, such as family ceremonies, marriages, marital family relations, or to have funds for other projects. And now in this newer Parité era, many of them have turned their efforts towards women within the state apparatus, and they're as a source of economic development. For Musli, on the one hand, the benefit of investing in these associations is having her peers active in ways that spur political support by helping her campaign. And for members of these associations, they have access to funds to pay off debts and to create more income. And so I'll talk a little bit about Musli specifically, Musli Diakhaté, and I think you can see me in your, but I'm going to be sort of referencing her autobiography that she herself has written, and part of what, a little bit in this chapter, but what I'm trying to do more in my current work is to see autobiography and biographies as an interesting archive or resource for, as one component of that speaks to her, to my observations of her, that speaks to her own observations of herself. And so it's sort of these, thinking about it as a different, a level of conversation that her autobiography as a primary source can bring. And so in her autobiography, which is called From Quranic School to Parliament, she tells the story of her childhood religious upbringing within the Murid Sufi community and to her political career. The second half of the book is reserved for testimonies from her family, friends, and colleagues, sharing their connections with Musli and observations of her life. Because she grew up with ties to the religious family Mbake, descendants of Serin Amadou Mbake, she was educated in the Quranic school. In addition to being raised within a religious family, Musli also had plenty of mentors in the political realm. Her father was a local politician in Tambacounda, where she was born, but it was from the guidance of her grandmother that she sourced her knowledge of local politics. Her grandmother, Fatou Ndiaye, managed a number of neighborhood associations and was a reference for women of her neighborhood named Darunjeng in Tambacounda, where no one made decisions without speaking with her first. She was the Merum Botai, or the mother of the association, and their political leader. She managed money pooling groups of women even before I was born, Musli says in her autobiography. It is important to note here that her grandmother was not formally educated in French schools, nor did she hold any official state position. Like many women of her generation, Fatou Ndiaye was seen as a leader among the community through her involvement with associations and general generosity of time, hospitality, and aid in other forms. And part of why Musli also entitles her autobiography as From Quranic School to Parliament is because she herself never attended formal French school, and she talks about how that's not, that knowledge and education are what is more important than what kind of formal instruction you're receiving. Musli herself also worked as a member and leader of several neighborhood associations in the Dakar suburb of Guédiawaye. Due in part to the increasing size of her associations, she was recognized as having significant influence in her community. This led to her to accept positions as a municipal advisor and then as an assistant to the mayor. She was president for the Women's Alliance for the political party Jafjel, created by an important opposition leader to Abdoulaye Wade's administration. Her parliamentary run began in 2007 due to her leadership among the women's group. She has now been re-elected twice and is part of the current administration's coalition in power. And the association she created began as a way for newly married women who were yet to have children to get to know one another. Much like sister associations across the city, the women gathered to pool resources together from an initial investment from a woman of resources such as Musli. The structure of the associations vary from a 12-month calendar cycle where one woman takes the whole pot to use towards whatever expenses she might have, to a system in which the total is evenly divided among the members. And I'll just share a quick sort of anecdote of what one of these associations was looking like. And so from the anecdote that I talk about in the beginning, we're up on this rooftop and the women have been gathered, and this so-called technical advisor, Fatima Ndiaye of the association, hired by Musli, gets in front of the group and tells them, kind of gives them an update and says, quote, "Everything you are involved in, you should know where it started and where it's going. Our group, Solidarity, Aid, and Peace, is an association created by our Honorable Musli Jahate in 2011. She's a woman with courage and dignity who is engaged. And even though they told her she couldn't do it, she turned around and created FADES, Economic and Social Development Funds. The group is involved in politics, but beyond that, it promotes sustainable community development. What does that mean? It means to promote self-sufficiency. When her party took over the government, she could have just taken the money and shared it with her family, but she didn't do that. Currently, the group holds together more than 250 associations within Senegal and internationally. Fades works on reinforcing personal abilities, such as teaching those who do not know how to write their own name, or training to learn how to plant urban gardens in members' homes. And then, on more of a personal note, Fatima continues to sort of talk about not just Musli's financial investments, but that they're a sign of her generosity and sense of charity, and that she uses her own funds to invest in the associations, and puts her reputation on the line with international donors. And then later on in my interview with Musli, I asked her about sort of what her thoughts were on this kind of idea of charity, and her view of her role as the leader of this group and as a politician. And she says, quote, "It's not everyone that God gives the opportunity to work with women's associations like I have. I created several women's associations and ensured they were working, and then let them continue by themselves while I moved on to another project. I have always wanted to work with women. Our group is mixed with men and women, but most are dominated by women because I have empathy for them, because they are tired of associations, money pooling groups with movements, with political parties, yet revenues don't come easily. In addition, banks want to kill them because the interest rate for most financial institutions are expensive and the loans do not last long. Senegalese women have a lot of courage to take care of their families. And even if they have a husband, women are the ones taking care of their families about 80% of the time," end quote. So in this excerpt, Musli gives a strong testimony about how much weight she gives her role as a politician to the successes of the association. Beyond herself, she sees the state as a more benevolent partner to women's causes, mostly as a third-party financier and through her own person, saving women from unproductive debt that private financial institutions force upon them. She sees this as a kind of personal charity stemming from a shared experience of being a woman. And just to conclude, I see Musli's case as well as Awa, and if anyone has questions about Awa, who I unfortunately skipped over, who is also extremely interesting. But what I find interesting is that their stories sort of demonstrate how this correlation between women's active presence in political life and their involvement with various associations that provide women with upward mobility and rewards them with people power or social capital. These benefits are created and nurtured in many ways by prestations of teranga that seem much like some parts philanthropic ventures and others political maneuvers. So I don't want to suggest that, even though someone like Musli is sort of framing herself as charitable, that she's not charitable, but also that she doesn't have a stake in it for herself. So I'll stop there and then sort of now transitioning back to my role as moderator, I will just have a general sort of question for the two of you, and then I hope that people in Facebook, have questions. So as I'm sort of asking this question and we're answering it, if you have questions, please put them in the chat here, which I'll be monitoring. But the question that I have for the two of you is sort of, it seems like the theme between the three of our chapters, interventions, talk about particular types of spaces and how women occupy that space, or those spaces, be it virtual, bridging of private and public spaces to challenge the realities that have, traditionally limited women's movement, both sort of symbolically and figuratively. The relationship between performances and ideologies of gender and space are being challenged. And so I wanted to ask the two of you sort of how you see the question of space in your particular study. And I think I find this particular question interesting because of because Martha is working on, virtual space and the digital as a way to open up new avenues for women and men to talk about gender-based violence, or about, just what it means to be sort of a woman in Namibian society, as well as then Mariah's case, looking at sort of women having occupied these pretty stark political public spaces of protest and activism. So I just thought I would put that out there and see what you both thought.
I can start. So thanks for that question, Emily. I think it's really, I don't know, ties together the chapters nicely and gives us some good things to think about. And absolutely, both in my chapter and in my continuing work, it is really interesting to think about how women navigated spaces in terms of advancing the struggle. And in feminism, there's traditionally a big debate, and there's been a lot written about the public sphere and the private sphere. And in this case, women really navigated both very deftly and in a lot of different ways. And I think that something that's really interesting is sort of the political geography of Namibia. And as I mentioned, the war was mostly in northern Namibia because after Angola gained freedom from Portugal, Angola was a friendly allied country. So a lot of Namibians both fled to the north, and there was a lot of mobilization between those two countries. And so the northern part of the country was a hot war, and it was just, landmines and dangerous even to travel. And what the women did was, again, to wage that sort of quotidian everyday power to hide freedom fighters in their homes and provide them with food and information. And it was really a matter of, there was no neutrality, like either you were assisting Plan and the South African Defense Forces suspected you of that, or vice versa. So women were really thrust into this war and this struggle. And again, a lot of them chose to be there and wanted to be part of the struggle, but just by virtue of their place and where they found themselves in that temporal and geographic and political social space, they were thrust into this conflict. And Marta and I were actually talking about this a few days ago. There were also really interesting ways in which women waged their cultural norms. So in my understanding is that in the Oshibambo culture, there's a private room in the traditional house called the Anjugo, and that's a space that men are not allowed to go into. And so women would use that basically as a weapon of war, because they knew that they could keep secrets there, they could harbor Plan fighters there, they could house secrets there, or any supplies that were necessary. So they were basically waging these cultural norms in the interest of the war. So just really ingenious deft maneuvering that was taking place. And as I was considering your question, I also thought about some of the posters that were used. So in the anti-apartheid struggle, there was this iconography that was deployed, which showed women carrying both guns and babies. And what I found out in my research is that that was actually used more in Europe to curry favor for the struggle than within Namibia's borders, because of course it would have been really dangerous. And interestingly, Emily, I think you'll like this, some of the women that I spoke with would have found that, they said that they would have found that iconography sort of insulting or essentializing them as if rural women were only doing those things. Or there was apparently another poster with women carrying babies and gardening tools. So there's all this interesting gendered imagery that was used in the interest of the war. And I'll wrap this up and let Marta speak too, but I'll just share with you a really interesting example, I think, that gets at the tension of women's agency. And also, I think both of your chapters speak to the way that women's engage and wage their agency in really unique and creative ways, and in ways that as an outsider you may not understand, and that you may have judgment on, or whatever it may be. But in the Namibian history, there's like a period called the spy drama, in which some of the Plan fighters were accused of being spies. And of course, like all liberation struggle, there were spies, but a lot of the people that were accused by SWAPO of being spies were innocent. And this entailed a lot of torture and a lot of like isolation, and literally SWAPO Plan fighters being thrown in dungeons and so on. And there were ways in which women exerted slivers of agency in those situations, in ways that, like Deborah Bolton has her ethnography about, we did it just to survive with Sierra Leonean fighters. And I see a lot of that kind of agency being waged. So I'll turn it over to you, Marta.
Thank you, Mariah. Before I address the question, and it's a fantastic question, Emily, I was just thinking about something you said, Mariah, which relates to the way I sort of want to respond to. But you were talking about the imagery during the war of women, as carrying babies and guns, and how the women you talk to found this offensive and essentializing. And it's something that comes up in my own research because of the tensions between the nationalist project and decolonial nationalism at the time, using women as a symbol for the nation, using women as a symbol for, these people who are suffering and therefore we must protect them, those kinds of narratives. And it's afterlives in a nationalist project that, that privileges tradition, cultural nationalism privileges tradition, but the people who bear this tradition are women, right? So women as mothers, women as, as daughters, and women as, as the people who we can look to see what tradition and what the nation is modeled after. I think about this in the context of The Dream of a Kwanyama Girl and these Facebook fictions and space, particularly because I'm interested in marginal spaces. And so are you, Mariah, sort of, these narratives of, women who don't typically have an opportunity to make bigger statements, and how women are sort of, women and narratives are challenging from the margins, challenging, complicated, and maybe working within the spaces of these larger dominant narratives. So I'm thinking of marginalization in the context of the Facebook fictional narrative, The Dream of a Kwanyama Girl. One, because it is a text that is performing on Facebook instead of a text that is published. Because if you read the comments, people obviously are like, this is a fantastic story. Is it a book? Is it a TV show? Is it, it's in first person? So is it, a biography, an autobiography? You should have this published. It's great. I can't wait to read the book. That's the comment. So you have this tension between this person who is making their work available on the space of Facebook, which on the one hand is, yes, you get the work out there and you're a writer and your work is being published. But on the other hand, it's out there. And so a thing in Facebook fiction is that people steal their, people get their work stolen. So a lot of people, you see these statements on these fictions. This is written by whoever. And in the next chapter that is, in the next serial chapter that is released on the Facebook page, they continue to title their work, as a way to sort of circumvent this. So there's that marginalized space. But at the same time, it is that space that allows for a text like The Dream of a Kwanyama Girl that is heavily sexual, about violence, really, sometimes really difficult and painful to read, And I wonder sometimes if that is why the author is anonymous. It's a painful thing to write in the context of a very conservative gendered nationalism that is Namibia. So it's weird that the space of marginalization also allows this particular text to live, and also allows for people to actually engage in the conversations. Like, so people are talking about Angola and these, these young women, and are saying things like, I don't want to think that these particular women are in Namibia, and other people are like, but this is real life. This is what's actually happening in Namibia. So when I think of space and marginalization, and when I think of how, it sort of inhabits contradictions, yes, it's on the one hand very, very, in the deep recesses of Facebook, where you don't even know how to begin to find this text unless you happen to come across it. And yet on the other hand, it allows for this conversation. The other way I'm thinking about space making is ideologically, because it confronts the idea, and I think I already probably spoke about this, it confronts the idea of patriarchal conservative nationalism and the policing of bodies. So in this way, the text definitely makes space, because here you have the music video PDK. And when I talk about the music video, I think about it very much in the context of Namibian society, where women were already sort of wearing miniskirts, dating men, and for money. And there was all this discussion in the media before the music video even existed, that women should not wear miniskirts. Why are women behaving in this way? And as a result of of women just wanting to wear what they want and do what they want, there was policing and violence. But I think the music video sort of touched on that, and that is why it became so popular. It sort of gave a name to something that was bothering people in society. But Kandeshiism, as discussed in the music video, is so conservative. It's in essence, it's a fun video. It's a great song. It's just gold digging. There's no depth to it beyond that. But this narrative sort of shifts the conversation to something else. Like, yes, okay, these women are doing these things, but it's more complicated than that. For one, men expect sex, and because their own expectation of sex, rape occurs. They don't know when, they don't accept no as an answer. They also don't see how women can just be, these women are also not just gold diggers. They are smart, intelligent, driven, educated women who ambitious, who want something for their lives, and who are unapologetic about their sexuality, which goes against, the policing that conservative nationalism and patriarchy does to women and sexuality. So I will stop there.
Great, thanks to you both. And I would just add to that, I think Mariah's point about, having actually physical places that that women, that are really reserved for women is not necessarily the case so much in my research, but you do see that, these associations, although men do have their own types of, usually family kinship tied associations, are not involved in, don't visit, where women are gathering, whether it's on the rooftop of their own home, but it's sort of like, oh, she's up there doing this stuff with her friends. And so it does provide a space and opportunities for these women to, in this case, just talk about, gossip, chat about problems they're having, or society, whether it's personal or societal, projects that they have, ambitions that they have in mind. And so in some ways, the sexual segregation of space, I think, can and women are, make it so that it can be productive and sort of somewhat emancipatory if they wish it. And so because they're not sort of under the gaze of men or other, and even their own children, it's a space, it's a time for them to be by themselves with, a different type of role among their friends. And also that what you said, Martha, about, you know, and Mariah as well, about this different idea of interpretations of, you know, symbolism, signs, you know, whether it's the Namibians of the diaspora, or, you know, if they're trying to convince people in Europe to provide funding. I don't know if that's the case, you know, for the liberation movement, that they're constantly, you know, sort of trying to play to two different audiences. And I think that was something that was really interesting about my research as well, is that, and Musli actually told me a anecdote about this Spanish NGO that had provided funds to her association, you know, and their expectation was that, you know, we give you these funds, women take the money, they get trained in, you know, small crafts that are probably, you know, generally speaking, more are just sort of reifying their kind of low economic status than anything, you know, not introducing them into industrial you know, labor, which is a whole different other thing. But their expectation was, you know, we give you this money as a loan, and you go out and multiply your money, and, you know, and then with that you pay us back. And Musli talked very strongly about how she with her own money decided to pay back the Spanish NGO because the women weren't able to produce enough to make profit, as well as, and then, you know, just given the daily expectations of you know, this social debt amongst each other, of paying for, you know, helping a friend with the death of a family member, or, you know, things that just come up on a daily basis that they use that money for, that they find productive and useful, was not the same for this Spanish NGO. And so which I think is sort of the history of the failure of development in general, which is for another day. So my colleague, Dr. Kakozi, who is our Swahili professor, as well as a specialist in Ubuntu in South Africa. He has a question for you, Martha, and let me see if I can translate this right. But he was hoping that you could comment a little bit more about the relevance and the of the Shut It All Down movement, and its importance of sort of promoting specific African cultural practices. And then he says another thing, what is your opinion about those who, and this might be for Mariah, so he's asking about if there were sort of defectors or detractors from these feminist activist movements, and what do they say about it, and what was important about it. Let's see. And do they sort of say that it was not sort of a locally sourced idea of, you know, of Namibians, but rather an importation of, you know, kind of Western cultural, just like we were all saying, sort of like this importation of specific Western ideas of women's rights. Coco, I hope, espero que ya te lo traduzca bien. Si no, me dices. yeah, so I think sort of one question for Martha and then this other for Mariah.
Thank you for that question. In terms of the relevance of Shut It All Down, well, for one, Shut It All Down occurred because of the murder of this young woman in Walvis Bay, but this murder was a symptom of a long-standing, I want to say pandemic or epidemic of violence towards women, in Namibia.
It's like new language that we all have to talk about, like horrible things that happen on a global scale.
On a global scale, but specifically in Southern Africa, like this kind of femicide is super problematic. Namibia is, along with South Africa and Southern Africa, one of the most violent places for Black women, for women of color. And it's one of those things that has just escalated over the years. And so there are constantly, feminist movements are constantly saying, this is a problem, we need to do something about it. And so when, so Shut It All Down was just one more woman, in a situation that was just, constantly going on. And so it was, on the one hand, it's relevant because it was wanting, the government to do something. Relevant because it was happening in the context of Black Lives Matter, the global protests of Black Lives Matter following George Floyd's death here in the United States last year in July. And I guess I'll come back to that because of, the question of importing women's rights from the West. I know it's a Mariah question, but I think, I'd like to talk about that just a little bit. So yes, so it's relevant because of that. Its relevance, I also see it as connected to, I believe it was 2018, the total shutdown that happened in South Africa that began there, protesting the narrative in the government that, on Women's Day that, the state of women in South Africa is fine. Well, women then decided, no, we want to make a statement that, things are not okay with women. So total shutdown in 2018 started in South Africa, but spread to Namibia and to other Southern African countries as well. So I also think that it's relevant that Shut It All Down in Namibia sort of alludes to that in title, and continues that tradition. Of course, relevant because it's, it was a movement that happened on Twitter, which made it very difficult for the police to actually police it. Unfortunately, as far as I can tell, conversations are still happening about about the things that were raised in Shut It All Down. But so far, the state, of course, has not addressed any of the concerns. If anything, things have gotten just a little bit worse in that, last I checked, and I'll probably need to reconfirm this, the government was talking about actually stopping sex education in schools and taking that away from education more broadly and saying individual communities need to educate children and, regarding traditional matters around sex and sex education, which is a problem, considering how sexual and gender-based violence is really tied to tradition in Namibia. So you mentioned, I'm sorry, I don't remember, I didn't catch the person's name, but
Dr.
Swahili.
Kakosi.
Sorry?
Dr. Kakosi.
Okay, Dr. Kakosi. You mentioned you wanted to know how this movement promoted specific cultural practices. I think it didn't. It, in fact, questioned cultural practices. It caused them, into doubt because of, like I said, the link between sexual gender-based violence and femicide and tradition, and how tradition is cast as conservatism for women and basically impunity for men. And so the movement was really questioning that. What it highlighted, and I was thinking about this in regard to the West, was how this violence, it highlighted the afterlives of racism in Namibia in its connection to global racism because of apartheid. So one of the things that was important to people was talking also about how this particular violence is racially, it's towards Black women and women of color, really. And so part of the discussion there was Blackness and race, obviously having to do with, the global, the global Black Lives Matter protests, but also Blackness, race, and sexuality, because, and drawing from, well, one of the things that was happening in the protests, one of the events that happened in the protests was, it came out at about the same time as Cardi B's WAP. And so women, LGBTQI people were gathering in huge groups to twerk, basically, as a sign of sexual liberty, as a sign of, these are our bodies and our sexuality, and we can sort of do with it as we wanted. Of course, in the media, this was, inappropriate behavior, etc. And one could think of those in terms of like importing Western ideas. But I also think that's not necessarily the case either. I think it's conversations that are happening. But the question about sexuality is not just a Western thing. The question about sexual liberty for women and for LGBTQI people is not just it's not an import from the West. It's a I want to say it's in the air, but it's it's a human thing, that is surfacing. And so because of the internet, because of the media, these things are connecting themselves in very interesting ways in Namibia.
Yeah, so I'll respond to that question that was directed to me, I think. So I believe the question was about if there were defectors or women that left the movement. And I would say yes, and in a number of ways. And that question actually brings to light some really interesting undercurrents. So in the Namibian struggle, there was basically contestation of who would be represented as the voice of Namibia. And SWAPO wasn't originally the only party, but they emerged as the UN recognized liberation struggle and eventually governing political party. And once SWAPO was recognized by the UN and allies internationally, they had tremendous power. And there was, that was a very beneficial position to be in, because there was political power, financial power, economic power, all of these things. And so that meant that there was also contestation for support on all different levels, and that included the feminist groups. And that actually came to the fore after the UN women's conferences in the 80s. And there was a group in Namibia called the Namibian Women's Voice that was very active, and that was actually at the UN women's conferences, and was a feminist organization that was really inclusive, and not just the one political party, but they were inclusive of a wide variety of people and representations and political parties across the board. And ultimately, SWAPO gave the Namibian Women's Voice leaders an ultimatum and said, look, you're going to either have to come under the fold of SWAPO and basically be under our control, or disband. And that feminist organization chose to disband because they didn't want to be under the control of SWAPO, but rather wanted to further their own agenda. And so I think that speaks to the tension of nationalism versus feminism, which was very much a tension during the struggle, and a really interesting indicator of like the zeitgeist of that time, with those UN World Conferences and the Cold War being, raging, and global feminism. And to the other question, which Marta was already speaking to, about the importation of Western feminism and so on. So I think it's really important to remember that feminism didn't originate in the West, and that's really evident in the oral history narratives of the women that were fighting in the anti-apartheid struggle, and that they had their own brand of feminism and were very much a part of it. And I like in Marta's book how she brings in Patricia McFadden and other African feminists and so on. So I think that that's something that like WGSS and global feminism is working on, to try to get right and be more inclusive and so on, but that it was already emerging, you know, at that time in the 60s and so on. And there's, you can see undercurrents of that, as I said, in these women's stories. So I'll wrap up there. I don't know if there's other questions.
Well, I don't see any in the chat, but I thought, you know, and I unfortunately I can't really tell who's watching, but I'm hoping that some of the students from our center or from UNAM, both in Namibia as well as Mexico, are watching. And so I like to ask the question of and I'm always, for myself, personally curious about how other people go about doing the research. And, you know, questions of methodology, positionality, you know, working in, you know, Martha, for you particularly, you know, was most of your research sort of online, or were you on the ground in Namibia as well, talking to people or conversing with them online? And I think especially right now, where like our generation of master's students unfortunately weren't able to go do any field work because of the pandemic, and so they had to get creative about how they went about, you know, getting the information or doing the interviews or whatever. And so I'm curious, sort of, as you both are transitioning from, you know, being students to then being professors, sort of how you went about doing your research, and what advice you could, you know, give them.
I can go first. So thank you, Emily. That's one of the questions I think about quite a bit, methodology and how I approach my texts. I should clarify and emphasize that I am a literary scholar, so I look at literature, and one of the things that was important, how I came across Facebook fiction, maybe I'll start there, is I was looking for, you know, African literature broadly, or as a tradition, you know, in its early stages, and arguably still, during the era of decolonization, was very much one of the shapers of cultural, you know, spoke to the project of decolonization, spoke to the tensions between cultural nationalism and, you know, and people in the everyday. And so when I came to graduate school, I was very much interested in how Namibian literature, you know, what are Namibian authors writing about in the context of Namibia's own experience with colonialism? How do they address it? What issues are emerging in their work? And I found, so when I went to Namibia, and I am Namibian, so when I went home, I was really told that Namibians don't read literature and don't write literature. But I think that particular response was because of, you know, one of the afterlives of colonialism, being that they didn't you know, apartheid was very much focused on making sure that Africans were not educated, you know, so that they could keep them in a labor pool, virtually enslaved. So I think the fact that people aren't writing literature in a traditional sense is one of those afterlives. So I had a difficult time. I mean, to be clear, there are novels and conventional, you know, writings, but I had a difficult time accepting that Namibians don't write literature and they don't like to read it, because like I said, I'm Namibian. I grew up there, and in high school there was a rich literary culture among students, and there was a bookstore down the street where we were constantly, you know, exchanging books. So I had to look other places. So my field really is online spaces, and also workshop literatures and all these little unconventional places to think about Namibian literature more broadly. What I found, though, what is important to me, so yes, I work online and I work in literature, but I'm also speaking about living people in particular cultural contexts, and I'm living in the United States. And that's important to me because sometimes, you know, with the US's focus on post-coloniality and the us versus them resistance model of thinking about liberation, it's important to me to go home to sort of recenter my brain, because I'm looking from the West and engaged in conversations here. But when I go home and I hang out with my family, just the simple act of hanging out with my family, and they ask me, what do you do? You know, and I say something like, I work on post-colonial literature. I'm trying to figure out what happened in the context of, you know, of the struggle. And that is not the questions that preoccupy them. And so that sort of, their glazing over, you know, makes me to think, what is important here? And that kind of, and how are Namibians and women seeing what they're doing, you know, in a way that I may not be able to see it when I'm in the United States. And when I'm just reading, you know, articles online, or, you know, Twitter feeds or Facebook fiction, what are they trying to do? So, which is why I'm very careful to think about these literatures and this, you know, not necessarily the activism, but a literature that happens on Facebook, not just as resistance. There can be resistance there, but there's also other things going on, you know, like, for example, my example of the women who are merely doing sort of what we can look at and see as resistance. You know, they're Kandeshis, but they're doing all of these things to get their lives in order. And you think that you could look at it as resisting a dominant order, but you could also see it as merely survival. And in that way, forming a community that makes space, you know, in a way that's not resistance, but it's, you know, it's still space making. It's still interrogating the norms. So yeah, so my methodology is, yes, you know, I definitely look at these literatures, but I also definitely do field work, you know, go home, hang out, you know, and just listen to people really, and see, you know, what's really happening, you know, to help shift my perspectives.
Yeah, I mean, I think, well, I personally think the hanging out and just being there is the best method. I mean, it obviously has probably more so in my position than yours, you know, can be problematic, because at the end of the day, I'm interpreting, you know, through my own lenses, as you are, you know, what I'm hearing and what, while I'm hanging out with people. And I think part of it is acknowledging that. But I think what you were saying about, you know, how finding what's important versus sort of what we want to be important is super important is super crucial, because I remember when I had my grant and I was like ready to go to Senegal with this project that I thought was so great, and you know, and then I get there and it's like, yeah, nobody cares about that, you know, and so it's like, okay, what do people care about? And so it's, I mean, a lot of it is sort of being flexible to what people are talking about. And I imagine in both of your cases, more so in mine, you know, talking about violence and with people, you know, maybe that's not I mean, it's something that people deal with on a daily basis potentially, but not something that they want to engage with on a daily, you know, even if they're seen as these super activists for the liberation movement. I mean, you can speak more to that, Mariah, but you know, so I think it is really important to be, and that's why I think being there is really important too. And putting, you know, and it's unfortunate, as you said, that you can't talk to the person who wrote, you know, this anonymous person that wrote these posts, even if you were to write about them anonymously. You know, that would be putting them into conversation with their own platform, and writing would be super interesting. But yeah, making sure that we as scholars and investigators are open to, you know, changes and what does actually matter to people, and that may be very different from what we expected or thought or hoped to find. And I don't know if that's sort of, Mariah, if that's kind of been your experience as well, or
yeah, to some degree. And to your point about not wanting to re-traumatize people and things like that, like there were definitely instances where I had women say, no, I'm not willing to speak with you. That's something I really am choosing to forget and move on. And as one of my professors, Liz McGonigal, she talked about actually forgetting can be a strength and a resilience that you're showing. It's not like you're too weak to remember, but I'm also interested in memory studies. So how does a society remember? And in Namibia, the commemorative landscape is really interesting because that's also kind of SWAPO's power dynamic. They really monopolize the commemorative landscape of the country and have erased certain things and so on, hence why they haven't acknowledged the spy drama and things like that. So yeah, I would agree with what you're saying. And I love how you said that, Marta, about, when you're doing field work and people's eyes gloss over, you're like, well, what's important to you? Like what, I think that's a really great approach to research, to apply it. And as you both said, what is important to people on the ground and so on. But I'll respond to your question, Emily, about methodology. So I use oral history methodology, and I'm an interdisciplinary scholar, but I was really drawn to that because it's very open-ended and it's also very, I think, feminist in its approach. Like you're not going in with a set rubric or set of questions. It's more like really getting people to share with you what was their experience and with this project, what was women's experience during the struggle. And to be honest with you, some of the best interviews were where I didn't even use the one or two questions I had. Like I had one interview where the woman said, "Oh, I already answered your questions. I'm going to email them to you later." So then we started talking about something else, and we actually went much deeper because we had thrown my pre-formatted questions out the window. So yeah, I guess that's a takeaway for me. I also used archival research, and I used both formal and informal sources, and it really depends on the country. So Emily had mentioned we were in Tanzania, and I had the opportunity to go to the Tanzanian National Archives, and they weren't, I guess, as well organized as in Namibia, and just by virtue of, I don't know the factors there. But in Namibia, it was really fortunate because they're really well organized. They're very safe. You can lock up your things. There's finding guides. And so they were really nice to navigate. And then also, I guess this would be a piece of advice, but another thing I found really helpful was seeking out people's personal collections and just those informal archives. So there's a woman who had passed away, and at one point I had 13 banker boxes from her personal papers and reports and things and so on. And so that can be really a rich source of, for me, I see the oral history as the primary research method, and then complemented by the archival research for context and so on. And yeah, I mean, there's so many things that I could add, but I guess one thing I was thinking about when you were talking, Marta, is, you being Namibian, and for me, an important thing that I had to navigate was my positionality as a white American cisgendered woman going into Namibia and recognizing my outsider status and just trying to be constantly reflexive and also aware, obviously, that you affect what your collaborators are going to say and what they feel comfortable telling you, and to what degree is their performativity involved and so on, especially in a place like Namibia where it's such a contested terrain about what history is being told and what's recognized, and there's certain economic and political ramifications of that.
Yeah, that's interesting. Something Mariah said about, that the person you were interviewing was like, "Oh, I'll just send you, my answers." And yeah, some of the best, well, I should say I learned very quickly, which should have been obvious to me at first, that I should have, especially because I was doing research, with people who already had stuff out there publicly about them, and which, is a different kind of research than, going into, a town where, and talking to the local grandmother who, you aren't going to know anything about. But with politicians, they have articles, and then especially with Musli's autobiography, I remember her telling me, it's in my book, just read the book. And so I had to, part of it was like, well, yes, but, you know, and so I became much more savvy about, like, you know, reading everything or watching as many videos as I could about, you know, of the person, and then kind of, instead of asking, like, you know, where are you from and what's some of your biographical, you know, getting into some more nuanced questions that have to do with, like, you know, you mentioned this in your book, I'd like you to say more about that. And so I think you know, knowing how to be prepared, both with sort of background information about the person, or if you're asking them, I'm sure you had to go in and say, you know, this is what I know about the liberation movement, you know, what was your experience? Instead of, you know, taking the time, like, can you tell me what, you know, what the liberation movement was about, which can also be important, right? Because you want their, you know, so I would always, like, ask people, like, can you define Teranga for me? Or, like, just to sort of see people's different, like, get some sort of almost statistical data about how people define it themselves. So it kind of, to be, you know, the work that you do to sort of prepare for the interviews and prepare for, even if it's just an informal thing, is really, I think, important, something that you pointed out. I should ask if you guys, if both of you have questions for each other, for me, or generally speaking. We're pretty much almost out of time, but I wanted to give you the opportunity to also ask questions. Because I'm sure you found out in your academic interviews of, you know, that the questions you ask the committee are almost just as important as the ones that they ask you.
Pressure is on.
Yeah, so this is live and recorded, so.
I actually have no questions.
Or comments, or, you
Well,
know,
okay, I have a question for Marta, like that I was thinking of. So I guess ultimately, and perhaps you answered this already, but maybe you can clarify for me, but because I'm really interested in your research topic, obviously that goes without saying, but what do you think at this point in time, like here we are 2021, do you think that this video and your the Facebook narrative you analyze and this whole conversation and et cetera, do you think that that's shifting the conversation? Do you think it's shifting gender norms in Namibia, or what effect ultimately at this point do you think that all of this has had?
Thank you. That's one of the questions I think about, you know, because like I said in my presentation, I do think, you know, maybe the author of the Facebook fiction would disagree with me, you know, but I think it's a form of activism, or it's performing activism, in that, you know, it's creating a space for discussion, whether or not it intends, you know, the author was intending to take on this video and this discourse that was happening in Namibia, in you know, in the media and in society, it's doing it, you know. So I think that's important, but I also think 2 years down the line after the video, you know, the song comes, this Facebook fiction is published, but by that time the song and its, you know, the definition of Kandeshi was very much entrenched in Namibian discourses. And so, I mean, even today I still see like jokes about Kandeshis, you know, and conversations about Kandeshis in the typical stereotypical gold digger way. So I don't necessarily, I think the Facebook fiction is a blip, but an important one, you know. And I think those particular, I'm not going to say that it's you know, shifting, you know, the conversation per se. I think it matters, and I think, you know, for the individuals who engage in this conversation, I hope it shifts them, their mindsets. There's no way for me to trace that, but the way I think about it, I mean, I think about it also in the context of how, you know, how it shifts how we think about literature. And this is a discussion that's happening in African literature more broadly, and its relationship to the media. But I also think about it as showing, as also participating in the conversations and the activisms that are happening, the more larger things like, Sister Namibia, or newspaper articles or radio conversations that are happening about this gender-based violence. The Facebook fiction doesn't have that platform. It's on Facebook, it's not advertised except by people who share it. It's difficult to find, and so I put it in conversation with those things. So no, I don't, if I'm honest, I don't think that it's like made this huge shift, but I think it's still important. Like small things are, I think one of the themes in our book was, things that are happening beneath the sightline, where people don't see, in the margins. So what are women doing to navigate, women or marginalized people doing to navigate these dominant societal ideologies that constrain them, they're not just oppressed. They are oppressed, but they're not just oppressed. They're also agents, right? So yeah, so it's small, but it's an act of agency.
That's super interesting because I think, I don't know, I struggle with that a lot of like, am I making this a really big thing when it's not? Or, is my curiosity about this phenomenon that's happening not really that important? Or is it, and to what degree? Sort of, you're saying like, it's not, it's maybe not making a big wave in the ocean, but in the pool, maybe so.
Yeah.
And one thing I was curious with you, Marta, is, whether, as you're doing this research and as you continue to do this research, on a sort of personal as well as professional level, since, do you feel like part of the richness of your, or of your interest in, this fictional diary on Facebook is the anonymity of the person? Or do you think about like, oh, if I could only, ask them these questions? Or do you feel like, because they're anonymous, that it allows your sort of imagination to create or fill in, what you might think is interesting? And if you've thought about that.
I have actually thought about that, but I mean, it's one of the things in literature where the text lives on its own, So an author writes a text and they release it into the world and it becomes its own thing, and it does whatever it wants to do. So on the one hand, I see the text, the Facebook text, doing all of these things. I would love to have a conversation about the author to see what they wanted their baby to do,
Yeah.
To see how they, what their ideas were in writing this text. And I mean, I think, like I said, I think part of being anonymous, and I could totally be wrong, this is probably me just, thinking about the way conservative, culture works in Namibia. Part of being anonymous is the fact that they're writing about this really intense subject matter. It could be that. It could just be that they would rather be anonymous, It's also important to note, by the way, that this text, The Dream of a Kwanyama Girl, is not just, it's not a standalone text in Southern Africa. There's a whole genre. I mean, my title was, refers to the online fictional diary, which actually began in South Africa and sort of spread across Southern Africa, like these first person narratives, deeply sexualized. The girl moves from the village to the city and she has all of these encounters, It's a genre of writing. So it's the first one that I'm seeing in Namibia. And maybe that's why they're anonymous, but,
And are the
so,
other,
yeah.
that are originating from South Africa also anonymous, or?
No, well, let me think. I don't write about them. Somebody else writes about them, but I think they were anonymous at first because if I remember correctly, there was major consternation among the readers when they discovered that the author was a man. Because they're written in first person, because it's a diary, and they're so personal and intimate, And it's one of the questions I've thought about. What if The Dream of a Kwanyama Girl is written by a man? It's no less feminist to me, but what if it doesn't bother me. I mean, I think it's, you know, it's fine. It's still a feminist text that performs in a particular way. But it would also make my questions to the author all the more interesting. I would love to talk to them, but you know.
It almost seems like, yeah, like the anonymity, not for the writer themselves, but for the readers, sort of allows you to, you know, when we talk about like gender and gender stereotypes, you know, knowing that it might be, you know, particular person, if it's a man or a woman, you know, makes it, or not knowing that rather allows the reader to kind of just appreciate what it's saying and not sort of where it's originating from.
Right. You know, yeah, they can totally get into the story and accept it for what it is, rather than thinking, how would a man know that? You know, that kind of, you know, it definitely avoids that question.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Well, I think we're at the end of our time. Any other comments from the two of you? I think they did, you know, put up here, I don't know if they did on Facebook, but about, you know, the title of the book and where you can find it. And we hope that, you know, maybe at another time we can have a larger discussion with the rest of the authors. And I would encourage, you know, anybody watching who is you know, interested in continuing a conversation with the two of you, that they could contact you as well.
Absolutely.
And thank you both so much for being here, and for editing the book, and obviously for including me as well. It was a great honor to not just, you know, and it was a different process. It was sort of, you know, not just here, contribute this, but let's have a larger ongoing conversation. And I think this today is a little bit a part of that. And I hope that we can continue to do so with the other authors and other editor, Eileen. And so, yeah, on behalf of myself and my institution, you know, gracias a todo por estar aquí con nosotros. Gracias a Janet, al Centro. And with that, we'll, again, thank you to you both for taking the time. And here is now the feature of my cats have arrived. So I think it's probably time to go.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Emily. And thank you, Mariah. I really, before we go, you know, yeah, both your essays were fantastic, and I'm really, really grateful for this opportunity to continue talking about, you know, the work that both of you are doing. So, thank you.
Me too.
And good luck to you both.
Oh, sorry. No, go ahead.
Good luck to you both in your new positions.
Thank you.
The exciting, and I'm sure maybe somewhat scary transition, but it'll be great.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thanks. Take care.
Bye.
Bye.